30 million times a day, someone gives a PowerPoint presentation. How many have you seen in your lifetime? And how many do you really remember as being outstanding? The problem with most presentations is that people use them to convey data rather than to tell a story. A compelling presentation should be more than presenting important data. A compelling presentation is used to persuade or inform, and behind either of those things, there is a story. I believe that presentations are more art than science, and I think if you look at a lot of TED Talks, you'll probably agree with me. The most effective presenters in TED Talks tell a story, usually their own story, taking whatever their specific topic is and making it more personal somehow. And so, in thinking how that might affect the presentations you'll be making, BU School of Public Health students, I want to tell you a little bit about a study on data, statistics, and persuasion. This is research done by Paul Slovic, who is a professor at the University of Oregon. And in 2007, he published a paper titled, "If I Look at the Mass, I Will Never Act." I've shared that paper with Wolfie, and he can share it with you. Slovic's paper was based on research about psychic numbing and the genocide in Rwanda. And the beginning of his abstract reads like this. Most people are caring and will exert great effort to rescue individual victims whose needy plight comes to their attention. These same good people, however, often become numbly indifferent to the plight of individuals who are one of many in a much greater problem. And I cite his research in this presentation now to make a point to those of you who are evidence-driven and who often rely on big numbers to convince others. Slovic's research shows that people can get overwhelmed when the size of a problem is too large, and this leads to a failure to act. And so relying exclusively on data, the sheer number of people affected by a lack of access to maternal health care, for example, doesn't often convince funders to support an intervention. I believe that the use of storytelling, supported by facts and data, is the best way to have a compelling presentation. And storytelling helps you persuade your audience that you've got an important point. So effective presenters want to tell their story with an end goal, and that's getting your audience from point A, where you're starting, to point B, the end of your presentation. And so you are going to lead them there from point A to point B through the use of a story. This presentation today is going to basically talk about four things. It's going to talk about why we present, and I talk about putting the co in communication. I'm sure that you know that the prefix CO in words means together. And presentations are a way of bringing you, the speaker, and those who are listening, your audience, together on the same page about a particular topic. So after we talk about why present, I'm going to talk about creating your story, how to find your story by the use of brainstorming, how to plot your story, that means identifying a good structure to tell your story, and how to start your story, that is giving you some tips on how you decide how you will capture your audience's attention. We're also going to talk about showing your story, and here's where data and evidence come in. I'll talk about how to support your story through the visual use of data. And remember, I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again, data doesn't tell your story, but you can't tell your story without data. You're going to need it to convince your audience. And then we're going to talk about telling your story, and that is the actual making of your presentation. So now, I'd like to introduce to you the effective presentation pyramid. This doesn't come from me, it comes from a man named Jerry Weissman, and Jerry Weissman is the author of a best-selling book called Presenting to Win. His book is the book that has most influenced me in my own communications work in terms of oral communication. And here you can see that he identifies 5 key elements in making an effective presentation. And the foundation of them all, in big capital letters there, is the story. And on top of that foundation, we talk about things like graphics, delivery, tools, and question and answer, or Q&A. So I'm going to be talking about all of these elements now as we move forward. So what's the point of presenting? Why do we present? If you've been invited to do a presentation, it's pretty much because your audience is uninformed or less informed than you are about a particular topic. And your goal in the presentation is to move your audience from point A, where you are, to point B, where you want them to be with you at the end of a presentation. So every successful presentation is designed with the endpoint in mind. We can say right now that your goal is to persuade somebody to fund a project or to inform people about a particular health issue, but think about that in more concrete terms. Are you trying to advocate a new practice? Are you trying to change the mind of skeptics? Are you trying to rally supporters to a cause? Are you trying to sound a call to action to really affect change? These are some of the things that you should be thinking about when you're deciding on your presentation topic and structure. Now, that second bullet point there, audience advocacy, you will not get from point A to point B smoothly without knowing your audience. This is what I mean when I talked about putting the co in communication. There's more than two of you in the room. Okay, there's a bunch of people, and Jerry Wiseman calls this idea audience advocacy, which is that everything you say and do in your presentation must serve the needs of your audience. So how do you do that? How do you develop this mindset of being an advocate for your audience? You have to think about who they are. You have to know what's in it for them. What benefit or what motivation do they have to come to your presentation? Now, in your case, obviously, this is an exercise, and they're coming in the role of funders because their motivation is that they have money and they want to fund one of your projects. In other cases, there may be other benefits for people coming, and you have to figure out who are those people and why are they there. And this is not as hard as it sounds. If you've been invited to a professional conference, for example, and you don't know that much about the audience, find somebody who's been to that conference before, or call the person who asked you to speak at that conference and say, I'm trying to find out the characteristics of your audience. Is it generally students? Is it generally public health professionals? Is it generally people with an interest in funding development projects, but they don't really have a background specifically in health? These are the kind of things that you need to know in order to make your presentation effective. Here are some things that you want to avoid in presenting. The first one we talked about already, audience advocacy. Why do people need to be there? If there's no benefit for people to be there, then you don't have a good presentation to start off with, okay? You have to figure out what is the benefit for the audience. No flow, no logical sequence. You need to lead or manage your presentation just as you would any other process. And you don't want your audience to feel like you're the blind leading the blind. So you need to have a flow, you need to tell them where you're going, and then you need to take them there in a logical, understandable way. That third bullet point up there, too detailed, tons of data or facts or non-stop presenting of numbers is usually too much for any audience, okay? So you have to choose your level of detail that you want to get into there, and you also have to remember that you can't have more than a few key points in any presentation. You have to choose a reasonable number of points to make, and then make them strongly and succinctly and repeat them. And so by that I mean that you really should have one or two key messages that you want your audience to leave with. And you will see that as we go through here. I've actually given you 4 takeaway points at the end of my presentation here. And so we'll see that when we finish up here. Too long. A lot of students ask me what's the magic formula for how long you can make a presentation. Well, there is no magic formula, okay? But think about how many presentations you've left thinking, boy, I could have listened to that person all day. Not very many, right? You're too busy, number one, and number two, most speakers just aren't that compelling. So if you've never come out of a presentation saying, that was too short, you can be sure that most other people haven't either. You need to stay within the guidelines that you're given when you've been invited to be a speaker, and you need to make sure that you have enough time to answer Q&A in those guidelines. And the last point is you want to avoid is not having any clear point at all. That would certainly make your presentation a failure. Let's talk about creating your story now. I said it before, and I'm saying it again one last time. Data doesn't tell your story, but you can't tell your story without the data. I think that the presentation process is a creative process, and a good presentation starts with the development of your story. But all too often, people preparing a presentation think that for their audience to understand anything, they must know everything. And so the data dump begins. They start dumping in all of the facts, everything that you know about a particular topic you want to get in there. That is not the right strategy. A better strategy is to brainstorm first, which requires right brain thinking. I like the whole science behind the idea of left brain, right brain, and so I use it here in talking about how we approach presentations. As you probably know, the left and right hemispheres of our brain process information in different ways. While we have a natural tendency towards one way of thinking, the two sides of our brain have to work together in our everyday lives in order for things to work. And so the right brain focuses on the visual and processes information in an intuitive and simultaneous way, looking first at the whole picture and then the details. The left side of the brain, however, is processes differently, and it processes information in an analytical and sequential way, looking first at the pieces and then putting them together to get the whole. I want all of you to think of yourself as right brain thinkers when you begin this process. You can tap into the analytical side, meaning do your data dump later, but try to rely on your right brain here. In the brainstorming process, it's helpful to throw out all the things you may want to say, present, or show when you're planning. But once you start organizing the way your presentation is going to flow, you have to use audience advocacy to figure out what is the essential data and the really essential elements to telling your story. So, brainstorm first, data dump if you must, and then start organizing. So let's talk about how you're going to begin. There are many ways to structure your presentation. I'm going to talk about the 5 that you see here. And so the first one is chronological, and that is telling the story along a timeline. And I always use the same example when I come to Wolfie's class. If you were going to be giving a presentation on HIV and AIDS, and you wanted to use a chronological storyline, you would really pretty much start about what happened in the mid-1980s when the epidemic was discovered. And then you talk about how people were dying, how the science evolved to identify what the particular problem was, all the different ways that various medications were introduced trying to change the problem, and then that critical point in the timeline where people actually started to be able to live with AIDS instead of die with AIDS. And then where we are today and how maybe the whole public health movement is moving toward a zero epidemic endpoint. And so that would bring you up to 2015. So that's a chronological example. Another structure for telling a story is perhaps the problem and solution. And that sets up your story around a particular problem. And I mean particular in this case. So you might look at the lack of maternal health care in a specific community, for example, and then the solutions to address that particular problem. Issues and actions is another structure, and that's a structure that you would use when your subject has a bigger scale. So if you were looking, for example, at the overall impact of gender on healthcare services, there's no one solution there to that issue. There are many actions that could be taken and that need to be taken as a whole to change things. And so that would be the structure that you would use to tell a story such as that, an issues and actions structure. Fourth, we have compare and contrast. This tells your story by looking at similarities and differences. So perhaps you want to look at healthcare in the U.S. middle class versus healthcare in a poor, rural African community, for example. I've seen this used very effectively, and actually one of Wolfie's classes a few years ago started their, a group like yours started their presentation using a comparison and a contrast approach to talk about when a woman goes into labor here in the U.S. versus when a woman goes into labor, I think it was in Malawi. And it was a really riveting opening that they did in that particular segment. So that can work. And then the last structure that you see here is a case study. And that would be when you tell your story through a situation of a particular person, organization, or health facility. You all know what a case study is, and I'm sure you've all seen many presentations using that structure. So now let's talk about how you will begin. You know that old saying, you've only got one chance to make a first impression? When you get up in front of a room of people to make a presentation, you're being given the opportunity to make an impression. And that one chance comes at the beginning of that presentation. So how are you going to start? There is no one right way. You need to think about your story, think about your audience, and think what will work best. And so here's 5 examples. Are you going to ask a question? Are you going to use a statistic? Are you going to present a retrospective perspective, meaning a look back and a look ahead? Or are you going to use a quotation? Or are you going to tell a little story, an analogy, to make your point? So I don't know if you can remember how I began this presentation. Anybody remember? I used a statistic. I used the 30 million times a day somebody makes a PowerPoint presentation. You have lots of statistics at your disposal in the world of public health, and that might be an effective way. Personally, I usually like the question approach because as human beings, it's in our nature to respond when somebody asks us a question. And so even if it's a rhetorical question and you actually don't want people to sit in the audience and talk back to you, asking people a question, not a yes and no question, a question that they have to think about, is a way to engage the audience. And so you might ask them, for example, what would happen, do you think, if you were to go into labor and you found yourself, I'm floundering here. Make sure you know what your question is before you start it. I'm going to move on from now. Wolfie, I'm sorry. You know that I'm taping this and this is the first time. I can't edit this out. So let's just focus here. How will you begin? Are you going to ask somebody a question? Okay. Are you going to use a statistic? Are you going to start with a quotation? Figure out what you're going to start to capture people's attention. And then, after you've done that, tell them what you're going to tell them in the rest of your presentation. And so I did that in the beginning of my structure. I told you what we were going to focus on. And that's a good idea for you too. It helps move the audience from point A to point B in a logical order when you go along. Now, we're going to move away from creating your story and talk about showing your story. Something important to consider is the role of graphics. In PowerPoint, graphics support the presenter, not the other way around, okay? This is going back to the fact that you're the presenter and you're telling a story. It's not the data that's the main point. There are 4 types of graphic design elements that you see most commonly in a presentation, and I've listed them here. Text, which is what this is. Okay, the graphic design elements that I have been using in this presentation are text. I have a PowerPoint and I'm using bullets versus sentences. But there are other options. You could use pictures, or you could use tables, whether they're relational, presenting relational information with tables or matrices or org charts, for example, or whether you want to present real numbers, and then in that case you might be using bar charts, pie charts, line charts, or other kinds of graphs. And it's very important to really think about this particular graphs that you are using when you do this. And so you want to keep it simple. You don't want to do something like this. So this is an example of a slide from a presentation, and the main problem is that there's just way too much text on here. Just as you, as the presenter, don't want to read your slides, you don't want to give your audience slides that they have to read a big long narrative in. This quite simply is just too much text. Here's another thing about keeping it simple. So this is a real pie chart from a presentation in an organization that I worked for. Now, it's not a bad visual. They tried to simplify it, but there are still quite a few things that you could do differently here to make it easier on the audience. There are things that I would definitely do differently if this had been my presentation. And so the first one is the font here used in the wording. It's much easier to read black text on almost any color than it is to read white text against a color. So I would have put the words in here in the pie chart: health financing, monitoring and evaluation, in black text, and I would have moved them out of the pie chart into the white area surrounding the pie chart there. Personally, I never opt for white text unless it's a really dark background. I also think that the font that the presenter used to describe what each slice of the pie was is just too small. It could be bigger. There's plenty of room here. The abbreviations aren't a good idea either. They probably weren't clear to some people in the audience. And so even if you have an acronym that you think everybody knows, if you have the space, spell it out. And if you don't have the space, you're going to have to read it and talk your audience through it. So here in this particular instance, for example, the presenter should have spelled out Human Resources Management instead of HRM, and LNM was Leadership and Management in this case. Now here's another example. Before we get into the other example, if you're going to use tables and graphs, you must have clear titles, clear legends. You want to make sure that they're conveying an appropriate amount of information and not overwhelming the audience, and you need to explain them as you are presenting them. So you would use phrases such as, what you're looking at here is, or what we see here is, and so here's what I mean by that. This is, again, a real slide from a real presentation that I sat in on once upon a time in another organization, and it is absolutely one of the weakest slides I've ever seen. So I'll give you a minute to just look at it. I'm sure you all can think of a few things that you do not like or that are wrong with this graph, and so I'll just point out some of them. One, it's trying to display too much information at once. This graph is actually looking at the performance of 9 different health centers. That's what the HC is in the abbreviation there, and the DH is a district health center. But it's not clear, and honestly, it's not important to the overall context of the presentation to go through all 9 health centers. It would have been better to use a representative number, maybe 3, maybe 4, and make the graphic bigger so the audience could read more. Look at that title. Average number of new family planning clients compared to anticipated measurable results for health centers participating in the Leadership Development Program, Kigoma Region, Tanzania. I can barely even say it with one breath. The title is too long and it's confusing. Look at the key. Anybody notice what's wrong with the key? It's missing a category. We actually have 3 colors in the line chart there, and one of them is missing. So those are just a few examples. I gave this slide, the graphic on this slide, to an M&E person in the organization and asked them to redo it so that it was more clear and more easily understandable, and this is what she came back with. And so now there's a representative for health centers instead of 9. The key includes all categories and defines comparable time periods. The data values are all labeled, and the legends are also clearly labeled, and the unit of measure on the y-axis is defined. Now let's look at tools. What tools will be the most effective way to reach your audience? All of the 5 that you see here can be effective, but their level of effectiveness will vary depending upon the audience. Will PowerPoint or Prezi be good? A lot of people ask me about Prezi when I do this lecture to Wolfie's class, and I am a big supporter and proponent of Prezi if you know how to use it. If you don't know how to use it, it can almost make people seasick if you are trying to present and you're zooming in and zooming out and going left and going right. But if you have good Prezi skills and you are comfortable using it to make your presentation, certainly you do not have to use a standard PowerPoint. You don't have to use a PowerPoint at all, obviously. You could use no tools and just use your voice. That's mostly what we see people doing in TED Talks, sometimes with just a few graphics in the background. It takes a well-practiced presenter to do that, or somebody who's hugely passionate about their story. But I encourage you to try it if you think that's you. Other kinds of tools, will you have a visual display? Maybe some boards showing a map of a community area or photos of some kind. Perhaps you have a video that you want to show. If you do have a video, it needs to be short enough to hold your audience's attention and still give you time enough to make your point. Do you have handouts? I generally recommend that people only give handouts after a presentation has concluded. Otherwise, your audience can be apt to spend more time looking at the paper instead of looking at you, and most presenters find that rather disconcerting. Also, in some situations, you may have models, visual models, architectural models that you want to share with people. And if you do that in a presentation, you really have to make sure that everybody in the room can see what you are looking at. Now, we're back to the effective presentation pyramid. We've talked about story, we've talked about graphics, and we've talked about tools. I leave delivery and Q&A until the end because these are the 2 areas which really relate to you and your effectiveness as a speaker. Let's start with delivery. You're in front of your audience. What are you going to do? First thing, remember that structure and use it to your advantage. So if you're having the chronological structure or problem solution, issues or actions, compare and contrast, a case study, use that structure to help you make links for the audience as you're speaking to move the audience from point A to point B. What does that mean? So if you're doing a presentation on the evolution of treatments for the HIV/AIDS epidemic using a chronological structure, 3/4 of the way through your presentation and the timeline, you might say something to the audience like, so remember where we began back in 1985? Well, now it's 20 years later, and here's what we're seeing in this year. And then you tell them. So use that structure to help. It's just like good writing. Use that structure to help you transition from one idea to the other. What else when you're delivering your presentation? Don't read your slides. Your audience can read. You might remember that I asked you at the beginning how many of you had seen a bad presentation. One of the key complaints I get from people when they said that they were in a room and with a bad presenter is that the presenter actually read off of their slides. It's just not a good idea. Say it loud and say it proud. Speak slowly. Volume and cadence are very important when you are making a presentation. If you are naturally a soft-spoken person, you are going to have to project your voice. Even now, when I'm sitting here talking to you, actually talking into a microphone, I have to make sure that I'm pitching my voice in a different way than I would if I were just talking to Wolfie one-on-one, for example. So think about that. You're almost a little bit of an actor or an actress when you're getting up to do a presentation. And speak slowly. When people get nervous, they tend to ratchet up their speed, and you don't want to do that. People notice. What else when you're delivering? When you use your data, remember to explain it and to give context. That next bullet point, get your organization's name in there. Don't fall into the we trap. What do I mean by that? I mean that these days a lot of presentations are either videotaped, kind of like this one, or the media come to hear a presenter speak, things wind up on TED Talks or on some YouTube. You need to make sure that if you are representing an organization, that after you introduce yourself, you don't thereafter refer to yourself as we constantly. You need to interject your organization's name in there every now and again so that people remember who you're representing. When you're a presenter, you're really an ambassador for whatever organization you're working for, number one. And number two, if somebody is to take a sound bite or a brief media clip of your presentation, you don't want to hear only somebody saying we, and then you wonder who's the we. So if in the middle of your presentation you're like, and so we at the Boston University School of Public Health believe such and such, that's a lot more memorable and a lot more effective in a soundbite than just saying something like we believe. Your audience might not know who you're referring to when you say we. And my last point here is practice, practice, practice. I know as graduate students that time is a premium for you and that it's very tempting to work on your actual content right up to the last moment and then skimp a little bit on the practice. You will have a far stronger presentation if you don't skimp on the practice and you make sure that you know your content cold when you get up in front of the room. So I just can't stress it enough. Practice is a key component in the success of your presentation. What about the Q&A? Many novice presenters hate the Q&A part. They feel exposed or put on the spot in front of people, mostly whom they don't know, usually. I love the Q&A. Questions are the interactive component of your presentation, and they provide a way for you to engage directly with your audience. So use them as an opportunity to support your main point and reinforce your message. Make sure you leave enough time. If you've been invited to speak for half an hour, for example, you really don't want to talk for more than 20 minutes, and actually more than 15 if you can do that, because you want to leave enough time so that people can engage with you and ask you what's on their mind. When people ask questions, use audience advocacy. Say things like, that's a good question, when you think somebody has asked a good question. Or even when you don't think it's a good question, but you're trying to buy some time to think about your response, you can throw it out then. Sometimes questions are a bit convoluted, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. When a person takes so long to get to the point that you're not even sure what he or she is asking by the time they finish, that's when you want to rephrase the question. That's a good way to start your answer, by rephrasing the question, because it buys you time and helps you think about your response. It also clarifies things for the audience who might be just as confused as you are about the convoluted question. The big worry that a lot of presenters have is, what if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer? My advice is just tell them. Tell them you don't know the answer. Be honest. You can do it nicely and do it smartly in some circumstances, like this. Maybe you can say, I don't know the answer, but if you'll see me after I finish, I'll take your contact information and get back to you and get that person an answer. Or if you're in a panel situation, you can punt the question to one of your co-panelists by saying something like, that specific area you're asking about isn't related to the work I'm doing, but perhaps my colleague here can answer it. Whatever you do, the key point here is don't try to bluff it if you don't know the answer. Be gracious about it and move on to the next question without dwelling on it. The takeaway. So I'm leaving you with 4 points here. In terms of how to make a compelling presentation, I want you to think about doing these 4 things. Develop your story. Know what it is, work on it, develop it, know it. Know your audience. Do your audience advocacy and know who your audience is and what the benefit is for them. Determine how you can best tell and show with graphics and tools, and then practice your delivery so that you will wow them in the end. I also want to leave you with a video, which I'm not going to show now, but Wolfie will distribute my presentation, and this is a live link. And this video highlights the power and purpose of storytelling for nonprofit organizations. It's a bit long, but I find that the woman who is being interviewed makes some really good points. So if you do have some time, you might enjoy listening to it and watching it. So here's the Q&A. I'm not there to take the questions, but I'm sure Wolfie can answer yours. He's seen me do this presentation a million times, and he's a pretty good speaker himself, as you all know, so I'm sure he can address your concerns. And if not, you can email me, and my email address is there on the screen. So thank you, students. Thank you, Wolfie, for having me again in this new way of me coming to your class. I hope it's worked out, and I wish you luck at your presentations next week. Thank you, and goodbye.